This suspect is different than most homicide offenders. In other words, the typical murder is driven by rage, jealousy, greed, domestic, whatever it might be. But it's not psychologically driven. Serial killers, and I'm not suggesting this guy is a serial killer, but serial killers are driven by the satisfaction and the puzzle and the excitement and the risk of killing people. This crime early on sort of struck me of all of those variables.
When you see a massacre of this caliber, the stabbing deaths of 4 people in one location, it's relatively rare that this is the first go-to crime for that particular offender. Very often things happen in stages and the person gains confidence over time.
There's no way that a person, for the very first time they're committing a crime, murders 4 people. That did not happen.
This person, most likely a man, has been thinking about it, dreaming about it, fantasizing about it for a very long time.
Absolutely, in my mind, predatory, and here's why. I have no doubt that this killer, and I'll say a singular killer, I don't believe there is more than one murderer involved in this case, but this person, without a doubt, has planned this. It was premeditated, it was willful, it was with malice. And so when we look at a knife of this caliber as well, this is something that individuals, Nicole, have tactical training on.
But that indicates that the person who did this brought the knife with them. They haven't found it. And the style of knife, again, reflects fantasy. This person has been thinking about doing a crime like this. They're interested in the process of stabbing. It's a very process-focused crime. And person who is obsessed with knives and bloodletting, this is the kind of person they are looking for. Somebody who may have tortured animals in the past, that's going to be on their suspect list.
But I'd also say that this offender, even though sloppy in the crime scene, leaving so much evidence, he was very efficient with this knife. He was able to complete 4 homicides and then leave the scene. That tells me this person has experience with that knife, a very effective cutting instrument, and that whether or not he would then or she would then throw that instrument away in the woods someplace is doubtful to me, because this is an instrument that's important to that offender. And I do think, based on the efficiency of those homicides, that the knife has been used before, not necessarily in another murder, but that the offender has used it before in other instances.
There was this picture posted just hours before their deaths. The coroner is still processing the gruesome murder scene.
It was very, very traumatic.
Yeah. Have you seen anything like that before?
No.
Autopsy results are pending, though the deaths have been ruled homicides. Investigators think that an edged weapon like a knife was used and that this was an isolated, targeted attack. Police say there are no suspects in custody and motives remain unclear. The mayor telling the New York Times it may have been a crime of passion, but later saying, we don't really know what it was. The police department saying there is no imminent threat to the community, but many are rattled.
I mean, how much planning is it possible that went into this? Especially if you think that he knew one of these victims, and it appears that Kaylee was targeted.
Well, certainly enough planning to be successful. And I think that there was knowledge of the inside of that house in order to move around with the furniture there and people leaving things on the floor and so forth. So to me, I would certainly be looking at whether or not that offender had been inside that house on a previous occasion. And I think it's also likely that that offender has been around that house on previous occasions, just to know in real time, it's called real time as opposed to 2 weeks ago, what the intelligence is in terms of what's going on inside that house. So all of that falls under the category of planning.
Cell phone records of Brian Koberger's phone, they wanted to see if he was stalking the victims ahead of time, and at least 12 prior occasions prior to November 13th, his phone was in the area of the residence. All of these occasions, except for one, occurred in the late evening and early morning hours. For me, that signals premeditation and planning, and why he's being charged with first-degree murder.
It is no doubt that the person who stabbed Ethan, Xana, Maddie, and Kaylee to death in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022 was predatory, cold-blooded, and most likely psychopathic. Based on the predatory and callous nature of this crime, I believe this perpetrator fits a particular kind of killer known as the power control killer. Classic examples of this type include Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Dennis Rader. If you're a frequent viewer of my channel, you've heard me talk about this group quite frequently, as I believe this is the type of killer in the Delphi case, which I focus on primarily on my channel. These types of killers enjoy the process of murder. Their primary motivation is to control and dominate their victims. They find the process of murder sexually arousing, and the act of murder itself is the most satisfying part and is the final expression of their power and control over the victim. Many power and control motivated killers sexually abuse their victims, but they differ from a separate category known as the hedonistic killers, in that rape is not motivated by lust, but as simply another form of dominating the victim. The aptitude of this type can be originated from childhood humiliation, as the perpetrator may feel weak and incapable. They often attach the previous bad experience to the present situation. Therefore, they apply the cruel maltreatment onto their victims. Power control killers are frequently stone-cold psychopaths, and they fall into the FBI's organized category of predators because they are meticulous planners, intelligent, and patient. They enjoy the stalking, capturing, and torturing of their prey. They often keep souvenirs or trophies from their crimes, which serve to sustain and refuel their violent and sexual fantasies.
Is there a chance the attacker did not have a specific target in mind, or based on Kaylee's injuries and the new things we're learning from her family, do you think the attacker did have her in mind specifically?
Based on the distinction in the injury patterns to Kaylee, those injury patterns from what's being reported appear to be more severe and different than the other victims. And when we would go into crime scenes, we would look at the wounds, the pathology of the wounds, and try to discern, was the offender after just one victim? And that's where the offender would focus their time and their attention. And oftentimes that was manifested in the number of injuries, the type of injuries, how the victim was placed at the crime scene. So that oftentimes is a way for profilers and detectives to discern who was the victim, who was the targeted victim. But I will also say this, there is evidence of planning in this crime scene. This offender brought the weapon with him, didn't grab something out of the kitchen drawer, or at least we're not advised that that happened. So brought a weapon, knew how to get in, and knew how to get out of that residence. And so the most important part of the crime is attacking the victims. So it doesn't make sense that in a planned crime scene, the offender just kind of wings it when it comes time to go after the victim, but does all the rest of the planning. So for those reasons, I would say the offender knew who was going to be targeted at the point where they entered the home.
Suspicion that the killer of the 4 University of Idaho students might be an incel.
They see the whole world through the lens of misogyny.
Nancy Grace, host of the podcast Crime Stories, says the killer may have been rejected by one of the slain women.
Incels are very, very dangerous. We know these girls were in sorority. I think that it's a possibility.
There's been a rash of killing sprees by incels. Elliot Rodger killed 6 and wounded 14 at the University of California, Santa Barbara campus in 2014. And Pretty Idaho victims were also in sororities and posted rambunctious videos of life in their party house.
If you look at the online presence of incels in this country, they are very, very negative and hate-filled toward beautiful women in particular.
So while I believe the primary motivation here is power and control, it's important to remember that homicides often have multiple motivations, and motives can actually change during the scene itself. For example, if a victim doesn't react in the way the perpetrator had intended, they can then become an unplanned targeted victim. So with regards to power and control, I would be interested to know more about his psychopathology and his experience as a child, if he was targeted as a young kid or even through his high school years. I think we did get some reports that he was bullied, and then that was followed by some extreme weight loss, and he then became sort of a bully himself, which is interesting. That kind of shows, this internalized domineering behavior in kind of needing to take back power that he may perceive has been stripped from him.
We heard those comments from the suspect's classmate at WSU. Does anything strike you about how they described his demeanor after the events of November?
Well, yeah, it's certainly concerning, just the fact that he was exhausted, his interest in controlling conversations and showing his intelligence and making sure people understood that. That certainly comes off as some indication of possible narcissistic traits. So it's concerning, yes.
And are Brian Enton also confirming that there were some incidents at a brewery in Pennsylvania, some aggressive flirting with a couple of female bartenders that apparently made them extremely uncomfortable enough that his information was in the system to be flagged at the door. Is this kind of behavior or track record with women significant as investigators are building a case and a profile?
It is significant, very much so. When you're looking at this case, they don't have to prove a motive in court, but they want to prove a motive. They want that jury to understand how in the world a PhD student, a 28-year-old young man with no criminal record, all of a sudden committed these heinous crimes. And these are all clue to his personality, aggression toward women. And of course, it would seem that this aggression toward women overflowed that day of November 13th, if indeed he is convicted of this crime.
Another potential motive here I think is definitely relevant is thrill and excitement. The planning of the perfect crime. He's clearly interested in crime and has studied it for a while and is interested in the process and the feelings associated with committing a crime. This is evidenced by the Reddit posts. As for the victims themselves, I agree with Mary Ellen O'Toole that because of how meticulously planned this crime was, and now we have evidence of that from the affidavit, that he went there 12 times, he was lurking in the area, and I'm positive that social media plays a role in this, and that's kind of how he may have been able to, keep tabs on these girls. I've heard a lot of rumblings about the vegan restaurant in town that Maddie and Xana worked at. That could absolutely be a connection. If he was hanging out there, that could be how he was, first came in contact with them, and then it might have turned to a social media kind of thing, where that was how he was able to fill his fantasy and plan his crime through keeping tabs on them. So I don't think that the victims were random, considering how planned this crime was. I think that these particular victims represent the kind of women he may have pursued. Beautiful, popular, intelligent women. I believe those are the types of women he was attracted to, and he may have faced rejection from these girls themselves or girls that have similar characteristics to the victims. So I think that there may be some internalized aggression and anger towards maybe possibly women that rejected him in the past. I don't think we've seen any of his prior romantic partners come forward and describe experiences with him. So, it's possible that he might be an incel, and he might have this deep-seated rage towards women who these victims kind of represent. And then also Ethan. Ethan is an adorable, kind frat boy. He kind of just seems like the quintessential college kid, just loving life, has a cute girlfriend, and he's in a frat, and, maybe he represents everything Brian wanted to be and wasn't able to because his peers wouldn't accept him because of his socially awkward nature and need to be the smartest one in the room. I think his grandiosity is especially relevant to this crime. And then this kind of brings me to another theory I want to throw on the table. And what about notoriety? Could he have done this to gain attention? If he studied serial killers and was sort of, had the obsession that we all kind of have, we gotta admit, these people are fascinating. They have interesting minds. And because of that, they draw worldwide attention. There are women out there who will write to serial killers, mass murderers. It's possible that was a way to get attention, to gain notoriety. And in his trial, I have a feeling he'll be very involved in his own defense, just like Ted Bundy. Could serve as some narcissistic supply, being able to be who he thinks is the smartest one in the room. Everybody's here for him. It's attention on a worldwide scale. I mean, this has got to be just fueling his narcissism. So I think it's possible notoriety is a potential motive. And with that being said, I want to read you just a quick excerpt from the Journal of Addiction Research, and this is on narcissistic supply. So the primary narcissistic supply is attention in both its public forms, fame, notoriety, infamy, celebrity, and its private interpersonal forms, adoration, adulation, applause, fear, repulsion. It is important to understand that attention of any kind, positive or negative, constitutes primary narcissistic supply. Infamy is as sought after as fame. Being notorious is as good as being renowned. So that's extremely fascinating to me. So it's possible that he committed these crimes to get attention, to gain notoriety and show off his grandiosity. And I'm sure during those days between the crime and his arrest, he was stalking the Facebook groups and getting satisfaction from seeing people's responses and people speculating about his mind and his crime. I'm sure that was just like the ultimate narcissistic high for him. So I think it's an interesting theory to kind of explore. It also could kind of explain some of the weird facts that we learned in the probable cause affidavit. He basically led investigators to him and to leave the knife sheath at the crime. That seems so contradictory to his goals and his education and his intellect. That's confusing. He also left a witness. There's some certain things that don't really add up if you're really trying to get away with this crime. Maybe he just isn't as intelligent as he's being made out to be. So I think, his arrogance could possibly play a really large role here.
Isn't it interesting that he left the knife sheath at the scene? Do you think that was by accident, or maybe he wanted to be caught eventually?
It would make sense to me that it would be an accident, that if this is a well-planned murder, and the fact that they have him or have that car in the area as early as June, July, August, in the summer months, in the realm of 12 or 13 times.
Hanging out around their place, like you said, for 6 months before he killed him.
Yes.
And then he runs. I didn't realize that one of the roommates opens the door and he's walking by her. But he doesn't stop and kill her. He keeps moving.
So I'm interested to see how this case plays out. Let me know what you think the motives are. There's no right or wrong answer here. But the prosecution doesn't even have to prove a motive. But the jury always does love to see a motive. Let me know what you guys think. I think that this is a psychological crime. This is different. I've been following it from the beginning because I knew, like Delphi, this crime is different. So let me know what you think, and I will continue to follow this case. I have a lot of knowledge to share on this kind of killer. So let me know if you have any questions or anything you'd like me to cover on the topic.